Hello everyone. This is Namranan, and today I'm doing a relatively different video compared to what I usually do on this channel, since the topic at hand is something I'm a little bit more passionate about. Now, I did say a couple weeks ago that I would make a video talking about why I think Blissey shouldn't be B rank on normal, and it appears that a lot of other people agree with me on this sentiment, so I'll just be talking about the viability rankings of normal as a whole in this video, and some other stuff that other posts have brought up from notable players. So, without further ado, I'll just briefly summarize what I said in my post, since there's a lot to go over here. But yeah, essentially what I said in my post is that Blissey belongs in the A rank at the very minimum, and that Blissey is just a way more essential teammate to normal teams compared to the B rankers that are present. So Braviary has been falling off, so Braviary shouldn't be in the A rank. Meloetta shouldn't be there unless TR normal becomes super meta, in which case I do think it actually should be brought to that rank. And then Smeargle is just very fringe, because it facilitates a very unique playstyle normal. And yeah, I explained that over here, in this section right here, so there's that. But yeah, and then I piggyback off of the Ditto nomination and the Ursaluna nomination, which I'll go into more detail on later, but first I just want to look at the post made by fellow user Matthias. Excuse me, Matthias? So Matthias, for those of you who don't know, is a very big normal aficionado. He plays normal a lot in every single generation, and he's basically like a generational normal player. In the past, he's used mons like Staravia to great success. And yes, I am talking about Eviolite Staravia with Feather Dance, I believe. And Roost back when defensive Staraptor was a thing. So yes, this guy knows a thing or two about normal and how it functions, especially in this metagame since he's been playing it a lot. And as he even mentions here, climbed to number 3 on the ladder with and has reached 1700s multiple times this month. So he did a lot better than me when I was trying to use the type. So definitely worth considering what they think of this type. So first thing he brings up is S to A. He wants Ditto to drop. Now, I've said multiple times in the past that Ditto is like a super broken mon on normal. But after reviewing, some of Matthias's teams and some of his replays, as well as seeing what other people have been doing on the type as well, I've noticed that there's a lot more Trick Room normal that I thought was common before. And I do personally believe that even though Ditto is just a really, really good mon, it definitely is just definitely is more of like a crutch mon in a few ways to kind of band-aid fix a lot of team building issues that normal can run into sometimes. The only issue with it, however, is that now, with stuff like Trick Room normal and other variants of the standard balanced normal archetype, you can actually get away with dropping Ditto because your team is actually fully functional without it. And that is something I believe is very important, as that means that Ditto is no longer a nearly ubiquitous mon on the type. Now, it's still very good, which is why it's only dropping to A and not to B or something. And I would even say it's probably on the higher end of the A tiers, but Ditto definitely is like not as necessary, especially with this new S rank update that they made. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go view my last video, which explains it a little bit, but to summarize what was said there, the S ranks are essentially They only allow 3 S ranks at a time, and S ranks basically are now like way more important to be considered. So essentially they have to be like near always auto includes every single time, and they don't have to just be very good. This way, it's easier for newer players to figure out like what mons can be dropped and which mons are really questionable to drop. And Ditto is one of those mons that now can be dropped. So I definitely agree with this sentiment a lot, and this was mirrored in another post by user TWK, who also thinks that Ditto should also be dropped to the A tier. And I do not disagree with this take at all. As because I haven't really used a lot of Ditto-less normal, but I have run different variants of normal, and I have seen that there are games where I don't use... Excuse me. There are games where I don't use Ditto a lot. And in those games, I essentially only have 5 Pokemon, but if I'm able to do all of that with just the 5 Pokemon I have access to, then that probably means normal is actually not as bad without Ditto as necessary. Now, for a bigger take, well, first we'll talk about Braviary before we move on. But yeah, Braviary going from B to C, this one I'm a little bit iffy on, because I do still believe Braviary is incredibly solid at making sure mons like Ditto are able to, or not mons like Ditto, but mons like Ursaluna, and as he mentions in his post, Hisuian Zoroark, way easier to put in. Not to mention, it can also help a lot with, it can also help a lot with Trick Room as well, since U-Turn is very good at getting Trick Room threats in, or even the Trick Room center itself. Excuse me, but yeah. I think the main issue with Braviary is that, and I've seen this multiple times using the mod myself, which is why I typically don't use it a lot myself. This mod is very, very easily overpowered by the very things that you would think it's supposed to be strong against. So, Matthias actually brings up in their post that Cinderace, Urshifu Rapid Strike, and Ogerpon Bellspring are mons that Braviary can like avoid getting 2-hit KO'd by. But yeah, as he also mentions in that post, it's very easy to chip down Braviary because it has to switch into every physical threat on the team. And even though it has Roost, it's still going to always be at like a very rough percentage where it's always going to be at risk of dying. And not to mention the amount of knockoffs that are going on in the tier, especially with fatter teams and fatter archetypes that always like to fit that move in whenever they can. And suddenly Rox is making it so that Braviary just straight up can't do its job. And that's very bad, because a lot of the times the Braviary is going to be used as one of your physical checks to a lot of different Pokemon. And if it isn't able to actually do its job properly, then it's kind of like a dead slot. That being said, though, Braviary is still very good at conflating being a wall and also having defog at the same time. It's just a little bit worse at doing it, which is why I'm not against the drop to C. I personally wouldn't drop it. I still think it should be B, personally, but I definitely do see the argument for it, and I'm not exactly opposed to it. So, and the arguments that Matthias makes are definitely very good, because I actually mentioned them in my post a little bit, but as a physical wall, P2 is almost always better, and what Matthias doesn't say it here, but in my post I mentioned that defensive Terrapico sets basically makes it so that you don't really need to use defog on Braviary. It's still nice to get the hazard removal against ghost types, which is very huge, but as it turns out, ghost teams actually have access to Goldengo, who basically can always swap into Braviary for free. So there's almost no reason to really use it, because if it weren't for the existence of Goldango, I would say that Braviary has a niche against helping you against Ghost Hazard stack. But since every Ghost team pretty much always uses Goldango, I think it's probably best if you just end up using Terrapagos anyway, and just drop Braviary for something a little more useful, like either in DD, Meloetta even, or even any of the D ranks too, honestly. Those, like, they're just typically a little bit better. But yeah, it's unfortunate to see Braviary fall like this, but after a little bit more usage of the type, I think normal is actually relatively not great. Or, not normal isn't relatively not great, but Braviary is not as great as it once was. Earlier in the generation, it was probably really good, and it definitely did do a lot of things properly, especially since Staraptor kind of fell off. But I think as of right now, it is not the greatest mod. So I do think it should drop. That being said, I actually was... One of the main things I was actually going to make this video on was to try and get Matthias to understand some of the D ranks. Now, not all the D ranks I can really do anything for, like I have no idea what the Dunsparce is doing for the type, but these three, Arboliva, Snorlax, and Toucannon, I can make arguments for. So let's just pull those mods up real quick. So Toucannon, for those of you who are already aware, I made a team that got to very close to the 1600s, just a few points under 1600, but I got to a relatively decent ladder ranking with a Toucannon team. And for those of you who don't know, Toucannon's signature move is Beak Blast, which is a move that burns on contact with the user before it moves. So it's a negative priority move, and essentially what this allows Toucannon to do is that it uniquely is able to spread status ailments to most physical attackers on the type, or in Monotype. So stuff like Excadrill, stuff like even certain move lock-ins from the Cinderace can be burnt by Beak Blast. So if Cinderace uses something like U-Turn, or if Meowscarada, for example, uses U-Turn or even Triple Axle, if Toucannon uses Beak Blast, suddenly Meowscarada is in a really bad spot, since now it is burnt, and Toucannon could actually have the option to wall it afterwards. Now, the set I used uses Kustap probably not the most viable set on Toucannon. It's probably always heavy-duty boots, but even if it isn't heavy-duty, even if it is heavy-duty boots, it's still able to spread these burns and then end up being a wall, and can also act as a pivot, which is something that we know Braviary is very good at as well, since it does have access to U-Turn. So pair that with the fact that it also learns knockoff, and it does have... Oh, I did not need to put over here, but pair that with the fact that it has knockoff and it can also use Roost. It actually is a not bad physically defensive wall. It's definitely not the greatest, though. It's frailer than Braviary, I would say. And it's very dependent on Beak Blast making up for its lackluster bulk. But with that being said, it is the only mono normal that can essentially punish U-turn spammers and most contact attackers with some form of status ailment. So this is a niche that cannot really be understated. It definitely can fit on teams. It's not the greatest mod, but it absolutely is deserving of the D rank. And I think it would be a bit wrong to really push it out, since it does genuinely have a somewhat decent niche on the type. Excuse me. But yeah, this mod absolutely can work on normal. It's just going to require a little bit of team finagling, but it is, I mean, I've actually done it myself. I've shown that it's actually able to work in higher tier games. So yeah, that's definitely a good mod. Or not a good mod, but a usable mod. But yeah, we'll move on to the next one, which is Snorlax. Now, Snorlax I have less good arguments for. So I actually also use this on the same team as Toucannon, but I think I said in my post that I would have been better off using Ursaluna, but the reason I ended up still using Snorlax was just to see how far I could get with it, because I just thought it was really ridiculous that I was doing as well as I was with it. But, yeah. So, Snorlax will just run a relatively standard... Let me just make this... Actually, no, I won't, but... Snorlax, very good special defensive wall. It's not quite chancy, but it's pretty close, because 110 and 160... Or, sorry, 160, 110 HP and special defense, respectively, is actually really good for sponging special attacks. So, I definitely don't think it should be understated how good that is to have. But on top of this, it's also a really good Curse Mon. Which, on normal, Curse is kind of hard to fit, but I was able to actually get some good late-game situations with Snorlax, and I think on a Ditto-less team, Snorlax actually wouldn't be that bad. The only issue is, of course, it's very passive, it has 6 move slot syndrome, and it just finds itself being a momentum sink whenever it uses rest, so it can be very hard to use, and using it as a purely defensive Pokemon is not really a good option, since it lacks a lot of the moves that you would want on a defensive Pokemon, namely any sort of utility whatsoever. It doesn't even learn a Thunder Wave. It's very, very passive. And that's like the biggest problem with it, is that it's extremely passive if it's not running a fully offensive set. And when it's not running a fully offensive set, it's not looking too great for it. It's weird though. I thought, yeah, I was gonna say, I'm pretty sure Recycle shouldn't be illegal, but I guess it is. That's weird. I thought everything lost Recycle, but maybe Snorlax still has it. I'm not sure. I'd have to check on that, but yeah. Yeah, but Snorlax, definitely a very strange wall. Definitely very fringe. It also has the option to use Thick Fat instead of Immunity. I think Immunity is probably a little bit better, but Thick Fat is definitely a lot more unique, since it'll allow you to take hits from stuff like Volcarona, for example, a lot easier, especially the solo attacking variants that are very dependent on Fiery Dance to do anything. Snorlax could actually just straight up beat it in a 1v1 if it has Thick Fat. The only issue is, of course, it'll get burnt, so that would be a problematic thing for Snorlax to deal with, having to get burnt by the Volcarona, but outside of that, it is definitely a somewhat decent... It could be a disinjected Volcarona, which is a problem for some normal teams to deal with, especially if you drop Ditto. But, yeah. Snorlax is not the worst mon ever, as someone who has used it. I definitely think Curse-Lax probably isn't the best way to run it, but it isn't the worst either. There's definitely some other options. You could do like a all-out attacker with like Resto Chesto. And if this Recycle thing is actually true, I think Resto Chesto might actually not be as bad, since you could do essentially an old Alolan Muk set where you had where you could just run a couple of offensive moves and then either use Rest or Citrus Berry, and then just Recycle and then get some HP back as well. Even though they nerfed the Pinch Berries, I think Recycle still is like not the worst. Especially if you decide to use Rest with it as well. The only issue is that once again you'll have only access to one move if you do all that, which is unideal, so yeah, it's really just a question of what could you do with the mon. It's definitely a potential mon, but yeah, there's a reason it's in D rank, it's just not that solid. But I wouldn't say it's like the most useless thing ever. I wouldn't say it's unranked. I definitely think it is worthy of being D rank, because it can do some stuff that not a lot of other mons can do. But if it goes up to underranked, I wouldn't be upset against it, but Toucannon absolutely deserves to be in D rank. Snorlax, maybe more of an argument for unranked, but I definitely think it's not the most useless thing ever. It's definitely useful, and it's gotten me to 1600s, or close to 1600s, so I wouldn't say we should ignore it completely. But back to Matthias' post. last mon is Arboliva. Arboliva is kind of weird, because before Indeedee became, like, super meta on the type, Arboliva was actually not a bad option. Or not the worst option ever, since you could use Seed Sower and actually just end up giving your team some form of recovery, and it would also interrupt annoying status ailments, or not status ailments, but terrains from stuff like Electric or Psychic, for example. But the issue is that Seed Sower would end up working against you a lot of the times, since it would give enemy mons that normally don't have recovery, like, for example, a knocked off Hisuian Goodra or an Archaludon, and that would result in some very bad scenarios where you're basically helping your opponent more than you're helping yourself. So most people would end up using Harvest, but Harvest isn't great for its own reasons. Now, that isn't to say Arboliva is completely useless. The grass typing actually is somewhat useful in the water matchup, which can be very annoying for normal to deal with, especially with Urshifu. But with Harvest, Arboliva is actually able to somewhat wall a couple of things pretty well, and Mirror Coat also allows it to not be too passive in the face of Mirror Coat and Strength Sap. Basically allows it to not be super passive in the face of certain attackers. So it's also not the worst mon, definitely not the greatest mon though, but it definitely has a somewhat decent niche with the ability to use Harvest and Mirror Coat at the same time. It can also be a screens user, but I personally would find it better as like a weird utility semi-wall hybrid, essentially. Since it does have relatively good special defense. Only 78% or 78 base HP, but 78 base HP with a really good special defense that is definitely not something that can be ignored. So definitely usable, and not the worst thing in the world. But yeah, the Dunsparce, on the other hand, I do think maybe should go, since its best thing is that it has Serene Grace, or even Rattled, for example, but yeah, this attack stat is just not good enough to justify using the mon, and even though it has a good HP stat, it's definitely not something that you would use defensively, because once again, it doesn't really, well, it does have some defensive qualities. It has access to Stealth Rock, and it does have access to, I don't think it has access to Rapid Spin. That's unfortunate, but yeah, it's a weird mon. It's a very weird mon, and honestly, admittedly, I haven't used it that much either, but I have looked at it before, and I wasn't really impressed with the stuff that it had to offer, especially since this was back when I thought Ditto was almost always an auto-include, so maybe I should make a team with this mon in the future. But yeah, I definitely do think that Ditto Dunsparce is probably one of the mons that could drop into unranked. But I might need to give it a try later and see like what it is capable of, because it doesn't seem, it seems like it could do something, but I'd have to see. Especially since Serene Grace Body Slam is not something that can be ignored. So yeah, I'll have to take a look at that later. But yeah, that'll cover all the unranked mons on normal, so let's move on to the rest of the post, which is talking about the rises for normal. So Ursaluna. So Ursaluna is a mon I personally do not like using on normal, which is, I know is a very unpopular opinion, but I really, really don't like how the mon feels on the type. And I try to avoid building it when I can, but I do still admittedly find myself adding it to my teams a lot, since it is just very strong, has a very nice typing for normal especially, allowing you to block both Thunder Wave and also a lot of electric moves that are very annoying, like Volt Switch, as well as Thunderclap from stuff like Raging Bolt. Yeah, this mon is definitely good and usable, and it also helps you break the double steel core present on Dragon, so definitely not something that can be ignored. But yeah, it is definitely a really good mon, and after thinking about it a lot more, I think this mon definitely deserves to be S rank, especially since S rank mons are supposed to be mons that can be used on every archetype. With my knowledge of normal having both HO and Trick Room as alternative archetypes, Ursaluna is good on both of them. Now you might be questioning why Ursaluna would be good on a hyper offensive team when it's as slow as it is, but that is because of Smeargle's webs basically slowing down anything that manages to land on it, and that includes semi-fast walls, stuff like stuff that would normally outspeed it, like Iron Hands, for example, get outsped, and some other stuff could also be outsped if you decide to run max speed. You don't have to run max speed on it, because I think it's still better as a bulky mon, but yeah. Basically, some of the stuff that doesn't... I'd say mons that have lower than base 100 speed, that don't run a Choice Scarf, they would become victim to Ursaluna's somewhat lackluster speed after getting hit by webs. So I definitely think with Smeargle's support, Ursaluna actually is not bad on a hyper-offensive team. So that is something that cannot be understated. And yeah, Trick Room obviously would be really good with Ursaluna since it has low speed. So yeah, I do think Ursaluna is definitely S-rank material. It can just fit on every single team, and it is a really solid mon at destroying some of the bulkier cores. And with its access to guts, it basically can't be stopped by most normal means. Because this reminds me a lot of the Conkeldurr set I used to run in Gen 8, where instead of I would run guts, but I wouldn't run a burn orb, so I could bait people into trying to burn me or getting a status ailment on me, which would essentially buff me instead of hindering me like it normally would. And even if they use something like Toxic, it's still good for you, since it'll still give you that boost in your attack. And I've seen a lot of people use Ursaluna in a very similar way, where they have guts, but they just don't use Burn Orb, because Burn Orb just cuts your HP way too much. And you need as much HP as you can with Ursaluna, since it has very high HP pool, but it can get chipped down very quickly. But yeah, Ursaluna, very, very good bon on normal. I'm no longer against this rise. I was very, 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 opposed to it rising to S initially, because I just don't like using the mon personally, but looking at it from an objective standpoint, I think this mon definitely deserves to be up there. So yeah, we already talked about Blizzard, but another mon that Matthias brings up is actually Staraptor. So Staraptor is a weird mon in this generation specifically. So I actually not going to read too much of this post here, because I already read it beforehand, but I'm going to go look at Staraptor in the builder real quick, just to reconfirm some things that I knew about it. So, for those of you who are new to Monotype from this or started this generation, Staraptor in the past has been used as a defensive Pokemon. Now, I know what you're thinking, that sounds insane, because most people know Staraptor as being the reckless boosted, Brave Bird close combat spamming, U-turn using a Bird of Destruction, right? But believe it or not, in Gen 7, Staraptor actually used a defensive set that utilized Intimidate, its somewhat decent bulk. With its 85-70 defenses, and it also, this was before Heavy Duty Boots, so it also just ended up using leftovers as well. And then it would run something like Roost, which it no longer has this generation, which is why it's not used as a defensive Pokemon. But yes, it used to have Roost, so it would use that, and then it also had U-turn, and then Feather Dance was another mod that it could use. I don't think it really used it as often as you would think, but it did use Brave Bird, if I'm not mistaken. And it had Defog as well, which it also doesn't have anymore. So a set like, probably not this, but yeah. So a set like this would be somewhat common back then. I think if I remember the EVs properly, it was like 240, 250, 252, and I think it had like there's definitely a speed tier that needs to rise. I think it was 240 that it was supposed to be, but I'm not 100% sure if this is the exact spread that used to be used. But it was definitely something like this. Or there's a little bit of speed investment, so I could add speed some stuff. Namely the, I think the base 60 speed Pokemon, but yeah. It would run something like this, and once it lost those moves, it kind of lost its ability to do defensive stuff. But reading Matthias's post, it's actually a good anti-offense Mon. But yeah. Reading this post a bit more, basically he talks about how Reckless boosted Brave Birds are very good, and how lackluster Braviary is. So, yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Matthias has to say about Staraptor being a decent anti-offense Mon, since, once again, flying is a somewhat slept-on type when it comes to how good it is offensively. Now, it is stopped by a lot of steel types, but when it isn't a steel type, there's not much really stopping flying from just completely blowing up teams. And I'm sure anyone who has used any offensive flying type Pokemon with actual flying stab, they find that out very quickly as well. So yeah, flying can kind of just like mow through teams very easily with like little to no resistance, because of like the few of there just not being a lot of switch-ins. Steel just happens to be one of the most common switch-ins, and steel types are like everywhere on every Monotype team, but when that steel type isn't present or is being dealt with by something like Ursaluna, Staraptor can suddenly just completely mow through entire teams with its Choice Scarf set. So yeah, so with a set like this, it can actually just completely mow through entire teams, and close combat also allows you to hit some of those steel types as well, like Bisharp, for example, or even Hisui and Gudra, who definitely would not like to see Staraptor come in. But yeah, Staraptor, very solid Pokemon. I would have to use it myself though. I gotta do a lot of new stuff on normal because I really need to see both the Dunsparce's capabilities and the viability of Diddoless normal. So yeah, I'm really actually kind of excited to ladder with normal again, and this time use a different set of Mons. But yeah, that'll be it for Matthias's post. Don't have much else to say about TWK's post, but I am very interested in what they have to say. So yeah, that is basically all I had to say. I just wanted to make this video just to get a rough idea of what I thought of these, both Matthias's and TWK's posts. And I do agree with basically almost everything they said, but I did want to reiterate on why Arboliva, Snorlax, and Toucannon were in D rank. The Dunsparce, I have to test myself though. I admittedly am going to have to test that one out myself. Maybe there is some stuff, because I thought the same thing about Snorlax that Matthias did before I used it, but after using it I actually can see why it's actually not that bad, so yeah, maybe I'll think the same of the Dunsparce once I use it. We'll see in the future, but yeah, that'll be it for this video. Next video will probably be something about the Gligar suspect that is happening, because I believe, I believe the suspect will either end by the time. Let me just check the calendar real quick. No, the suspect will still be going on by the time I post the video next week. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure if I want to talk about the Gligar suspect, because like low-key kind of already talked about everything I wanted to talk about in my Monotype metagame review video that I made once NPL ended and they sent out the survey. So I low-key don't want to just basically talk about the same thing I said before, because most of the stuff I said in that video has not changed. In my opinion, it hasn't changed, which was essentially I don't mind if it gets banned, but I do think that if it does get banned, it might have really bad ramifications on the metagame, especially since it was just holding back a lot of mons from being super broken, but maybe it is the right thing we need at this time in Monotype, since a lot of people have been asking for it to get banned, so we'll see how it goes. And like I said, I'm not opposed to it getting banned, it's just a very dangerous ban, is all I say. But yeah, I will see you guys next time. Be sure to take care of yourselves and have a great day.